At the head of his storm vermin bodyguard, Grey Seer Arqueek proudly contemplated his vast army, which he had at his command. It seemed that even the gigantic cavern in which the battle was about to take place could hardly contain all of the Skaven assembled there. Advancing as a living tide of mangy fur, the Skaven horde was rapidly closing the distance, separated it from the disciplined ranks of the enemy, the hated dwarf things. At the front of the Skaven line, the Grey Seer noticed crazed plague monks of Clan Pestilence breaking into a run. Foaming at the mouth, the deranged heralds of Pestilence charged towards the enemy too soon, showing no respect for the clever battle plan that the Grey Seer had devised. "Fools," thought Arqueek. As the monks charged in, the dwarves opened fire. A volley of crossbow bolts and handgun bullets tore through the first rank of the plague monks, cutting down many of the fanatics. They seemed oblivious to the casualties, and trampled over the wounded in their mad lust to reach the enemy. A sinister hiss rose from the dwarf line as two of their war engines fired simultaneously. Two huge gouts of fire were projected through the air in a slow-moving arc, landing in the middle of the plague monks. The flames enveloped the devotees of Clan Pestilence with horrific results. Most of them died, screaming in the blaze. But some of them kept charging, their robes and fur burning. They finally reached the dwarf line, where they managed to drag down several astonished dwarfs before the rest of the bearded warriors could cut them down. The Grey Seer was impressed by the ferocity displayed by the monks, and made a mental note never to displease their clan, if at all possible. Their savage charge had helped his plan after all. Attracting most of the dwarf's firepower, they had allowed the rest of the horde to reach the dwarf line relatively unharmed. Large units of lightly armed Skaven were now charging the dwarf warriors, clashing in bitter melee. The heavily armed dwarfs formed a solid shield wall, their axes and hammers exacting a heavy toll on the rat men. Here and there, though, a dwarf was overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of his opponents and was dragged down and torn to pieces. Where this happened, another dwarf warrior resolutely stepped in to close the gap in the shield wall, and the line held. After the initial ferocious assault, the Skaven quickly lost courage, broke and fled in disorder, too fast for the dwarves to follow. The Grey Seer observed the fleeing Skaven, and a smile formed on his lips. This first wave of attackers had been made up, for the most part, of enslaved clan rats, and had served its purpose of testing the dwarf defence. Even better, lying among the piles of dead slaves, he could see a decent number of dwarf things. The casualties were in the order of 10 to 1 in favour of the dwarfs. Good. The fight was going unexpectedly well, thought Arqueek. The main regiments of the Skaven army were waiting just behind the large masses of fleeing slaves, and, at the Grey Seer's signal, started to move forward. This second wave was made up of many units of clanrat warriors, and several large packs of giant rats goaded into battle by Clan Moulder packmasters. These were not the only beasts of Moulder present on the battlefield, however. Just in front of Arqueek's storm vermin, a line of massive rat ogres was unleashed against the dwarfs. Surprised by the silence of the dwarfs' war machines, the seer extended his magical perception to examine the enemy artillery. His spirit pulled free from his body and rose above the fighting, crossing the entire battlefield in a flash to finally focus on the enemy's gun emplacements. He soon realized that the diversion created by the slaves had served a double purpose, allowing Clan Eshin's adepts to sneak their way to the back of the dwarf line and attack the cannons. The dwarfs manning the guns put up a brave fight, but they were soon dispatched by the poisoned blades of the gutter runners. Good, thought the Grey Seer. Now the lethal adepts of Clan Eshin would attack the dwarf line from the back and rout their missile troops completely. In his mind's eye, Arkweek saw the gutter runners hurl a flurry of poison throwing stars into a regiment of dwarf thunderers. But then, when the surviving dwarfs turned around to return fire, the black Eshin warriors turned tail and disappeared. The cowards, thought the Grey Seer, outraged. Or maybe they were just being too literal about their orders, he wondered. Perhaps with the elimination of the dwarf artillery, the gutter runners had decided they had earned their fee, and left before having to suffer too many casualties. Arkweek would have a word with their leader after the battle. Arkweek turned his attention back to the action in front of him, where the rat ogres had almost made contact with the dwarf line. This time, the fight was very different. On the left and right flank, the clan rats and giant rats were holding their own against the dwarfs. Their efforts in reaching the enemy's shield wall were helped by small units of Clan Skyer globadiers. These specialist troops wore strangely protective masks and were armed with glass globes filled with deadly poison gas. Their weapons killed many bearded ones, together with quite a few Skaven when one of the globes missed its target, or landed in the thick of a fight. That didn't matter, thought Arkweek. The dwarfs were like a small island in a vast sea of brown fur. Still, the Skaven Seer had to admit that the dwarf things were fighting well, and he could see that the battle still hung in the balance. Then the charge of the rat ogres bit home. The great beasts tore their way through the dwarf line with pleasuring ease. The dwarf warriors were lifted into the air and quartered by the slashing claws of Clan Moulder's feral monsters. If a dwarf axe managed to penetrate the tough hide of one of the rat ogres, the wounded beast would just fight more ferociously, continuing the slaughter with renewed fury. The packmasters simply walked behind their creatures, stopping only to slit the throat of one of the few dwarfs that had been only wounded by one of the rat ogres. Under such an onslaught, the dwarf morale finally gave way, and they ran, pursued by the ravenous monsters. The storm vermin rushed forward to take advantage of the gap opened by the rat ogres in the enemy line. Following in the wake of Clan Moulder's powerful war beasts, the Grey Seer and his bodyguards had to step over the broken bodies of many Skaven and dwarf things. Arkweek was convinced that the battle was won. Soon he would be feasting on the dwarf lord's entrails. Right in front of the rat ogres, a mighty battle cry rang loud. A new regiment of dwarfs had entered the fray, charging forward from the back of the dwarf line. The seer was sure he had seen no troops held in reserve. This new unit had probably just arrived on the site of battle. These dwarfs were different from the others. They wore no armor and were covered in tattoos, and all of their fur had been dyed bright orange or red. Slayers. Arkweek was very close to squirting the musk of fear as he remembered the accounts that Grey Seer Thankwall had given to the council of the battle prowess of these mad, death-seeking dwarfs. He immediately ordered the storm vermin to halt. Hurling themselves towards the rat ogres, the slayers caught the large creatures unprepared. It was unusual for them to be attacked with such reckless ferocity. The dim-witted beasts were used to inspiring fear in their enemies, but these ones were different, and the monsters were puzzled, almost afraid. The Grey Seer couldn't believe his own eyes, even as the rat ogres were cut down one by one. Arkweek was particularly concerned about one huge slayer, wielding a massive hammer encrusted in glowing runes. Every irresistible strike of the weapon pulverized the skull of another rat ogre. A few of the badly wounded monsters fought back viciously, eviscerating many of the slayers before finally succumbing to the dwarfs' axes. The others turned to flee, trampling the Moulder packmasters who vainly tried to keep them in the fight with their whips. The dwarfs started to pursue the mutated monsters, but, catching sight of the Skaven's general storm vermin bodyguard, changed direction and ran towards the elite enemy. Bellowing guttural challenges, the seer was about to order a prudent tactical retreat when he remembered the Skyer rattling gun he had hired to support his storm vermin. If the new machine was half as good as the warlock engineers promised. "Fire! Fire!" ordered Arkweek, pointing at the slayers. The Skyer weapons team aimed their multi-barreled gun at the dwarfs and activated a warpstone gas pump that powered the weird machine. The weapon's first burst cut a red swathe through the dwarfs, slowing their advance. The Skyer engineers started to cackle maniacally, turning wildly on the crank that raised the rate of fire of the machine to augment the already impressive rain of death. More and more Slayers were coming to meet their maker. Grey Seer Arquick was impressed. The weapon was certainly worth the astronomical price he had paid for it. Then, suddenly, something went wrong. With a high-pitched whistle, a leak appeared in the canisters fueling the gun's pump, and a huge green scalding cloud surrounded the weapons team. Screams of pain reached Arquick, and he saw that the weapon was still firing, but the crew had lost all control over the direction they were firing in. The weapon's bursts drew a semicircular arc on the ground, around the rattling gun, and reached the terrified storm vermin. Many of the elite warriors were gunned down before the machine finally exploded, vaporizing the crew. Those treacherous fools had obviously sold him a flawed machine. The sorcerer was covered in the blood of his bodyguard. Somebody was going to pay for that. The Grey Seer had to abandon his plans of revenge when he realized he had far more pressing problems to hand. The few Slayers left, led by the terrifying one with the runic hammer, were almost upon him. Arquick raised a paw and pointed it towards the Slayers, chanting words of power as he evoked a powerful spell against the dwarfs. A green glow pulsated around his claws and then fizzled into nothingness. To his surprise, the Skaven felt that an external force was fighting his magic, coming from somewhere in the dwarf line. But that couldn't be. He was a powerful Grey Seer. He couldn't be defeated by one of those old dwarfs and their trivial rune magic. Arquick quickly scoffed a piece of warpstone and soon felt the power surging through his entire being. It was an exhilarating sensation, and the Grey Seer savoured it deeply before unleashing his new power against the dwarfs. This time there was nothing the runesmith could do to stop the green lightning erupting from Arquick's outstretched paw. The Slayers, now a few meters away, were hit by warp lightning and died where they stood, consumed by the evil energy that arced from one dwarf to another, melting their flesh and charring their bones. A satisfied growl emerged from the Seer's throat as his enemies burned. Soon all that was left of the Slayers were a few smoking husks. That's how it should be. All of his enemies were going to suffer the same fate. First, these pathetic dwarf things, later the fools that sold the malfunctioning rattling gun, and then those cowardly gutter runners. Much to Arquick's dismay, the hammer-wielding Slayer picked himself up from the ground, his body covered in horrible blisters, his hair completely burned away. Before the surprised Grey Seer realized what was going on, the Slayer was upon them. The dwarf, his face mad with fury, headed resolutely towards the hated Skaven, felling a storm vermin at every step. "Kill! Kill!" shouted Arquick desperately to his bodyguards, trying frantically to push behind the ranks of armoured Skaven warriors. Then he stumbled on a corpse and fell to the ground. A few storm vermin stepped forward to protect him, but the dwarf's hammer quickly dispatched them. The crazed dwarf reached the Grey Seer and raised his mighty weapon for the killing blow. Paralysed by terror, all that the Skaven could do was stare at the rune-encrusted hammer about to descend on him. Suddenly, a shadow passed over the Skaven wizard. A cloaked figure had emerged out of nowhere and leapt to interpose itself between the dwarf and the Grey Seer. The mysterious figure was wielding a pair of wicked daggers that he had plunged, blades crossed, into the base of the Slayer's neck. The dwarf looked puzzled, as if he could not understand what had just happened. Then, with a vicious scissoring action, the black-robed Skaven pulled the blades outwards, and the head of the Slayer fell to the floor with a sinister thud. Turning towards the Grey Seer, the Eshin assassin smiled, revealing a set of vicious fangs. He spoke in a grim, hissing voice.
"Grey Seer, my masters trust your plan. They don't want you dead today. Get up and finish the dwarf things. Do not let us down, Grey Seer."
With that, the assassin darted back through the ranks of the surprised storm vermin and disappeared into the confusion of battle. leaving behind a very perplexed Grey Seer, his heart just starting to slow down. After many hours of bitter fighting, the weary Seer was at last witnessing his great plan bloom. The huge numbers of Skaven had prevailed and eventually overwhelmed the dwarf defence. Their shield wall had broken. One after the other, the stubborn dwarf regiments had been surrounded and massacred by the Ratmen. Only one unit of the dwarf things still remained. Heavily armoured warriors, with high-crested helmets and huge warhammers, were putting up a stalwart last stand, their backs to the gigantic doors that were the entrance to their ancestral home. In their midst, Arqueek easily recognised the leader of the enemy, a grim dwarf whose armour and axe were so encrusted with runes that the Skaven's eyes ached just to look upon him. Several times the savage charge of the clan rats had broken against these elite warriors, and now the situation had come to a standstill. The dwarfs were surrounded, but outnumbered 100 to 1. The clan rats were hesitating. They didn't dare get too close to those lethal warhammers. Arqueek was furious. Surely he'd been given command of some of the most cowardly troopers in the Under-Empire. He had run out of warpstone now, and his magic would struggle to affect the dwarfs massed around their protective runic banner. He decided instead to vent his frustration by blasting a few Skaven to smithereens as an example of what happened to those who disobeyed his orders, and to inspire a bit of courage in his underlings. As the Skaven sorcerer scanned his troops for suitable victims, his eyes fell on the last surviving regiment of slaves. He noticed they were unusually cheerful, and suddenly remembered the promise he had made to the slaves in his inspiring speech before the battle.
Fight the dwarf things, freedom to all those who survive.
The slaves had fought well indeed, and he was now annoyed by the fact that he should now free them. A feral gleam touched his eyes as a solution formed in Arqueek's mind. The Grey Seer was pleased that, as usual, his mighty intellect had conceived the perfect way to get rid of both those last enemies and the overconfident slaves. The Grey Seer of the Horned Rat raised his claws high above his head and began chanting a prayer to his foul god. A dark, billowing cloud rose up and covered the entire unit of slaves. As the Skaven inhaled the vapours, their cheers of hope for the freedom promised to them were transformed into snarls of barely contained bloodlust. Some of the slaves started hacking at each other in order to satisfy the desperate desire to kill that had got hold of their minds. Rising to his full stature, the Grey Seer pointed towards the last of the dwarf defenders, ordering them in a booming voice,
Them! Get them!
With a ferocious roar, the slaves charged the dwarfs, their small, red eyes filled with fury. The leader of the storm vermin turned towards his superior to express his doubts.
Our most honourable enemy. Many clan rats die. What can slaves do?
With a wicked smile on his lips, Arqueek answered in a whisper.
What can slaves do? They keep the dwarf things busy, for just enough time. All warp fire throwers fire! Quick!
A respectful expression appeared on the storm vermin's face as understanding struck him. The armoured ratman bowed low and answered, Yes, O most clever of generals.